So I think a topic when it comes to the Secretary of State's race that's on a lot of people's minds is the issue of election security. Do you feel like, should Hoosiers feel like Indiana's elections are secure?
Well, what we do know is that our state leadership is not doing enough to ensure that our voting machines are secure in the state of Indiana. We know that our voting machines are vulnerable in this state, and we know that Indiana and the entire country is a target. What I'm concerned about is that we haven't taken enough steps to make sure that we're securing our voting machines this year.
So what steps would you take?
I'm a strong supporter of making sure that there's a voter-verified paper trail, paper ballots essentially, in every county. Indiana is one of only 13 states that does not require a voter-verified paper trail. Most counties do not have them. I think that we need to enact them. I wish we had done it this year for the 2018 elections, but absolutely we need to do it for 2020.
And now that's something that Connie Lawson has talked about, which is the idea of she does want to move towards that. These recommendations came out from the national level about all these things that states should be doing, some of which Indiana has been doing, some of which, notably the paper ballots, it is not. But that also requires money. So is Connie Lawson just in a bind for this particular cycle?
We could have had paper ballots this year. The reason that we do not is because Secretary Lawson did not show leadership on the issue. There are federal funds available that will help us, that could have helped us this year change to paper machines in every county. Secretary Lawson decided not to use it for that purpose. And moreover, she also decided not to go to the legislature at any point in the last 2 years to request funding to make sure that we upgrade our machines.
Beyond election security, there's the issue of election reforms. I'll start with this, which is the Secretary of the State the person who should be advocating for reforms like independent redistricting?
Yes, the Secretary of State is the Chief Elections Officer. So I think it's critical that the person in that office show leadership on making sure that our election system is more fair and more robust. You mentioned nonpartisan redistricting. I think that there is no bigger threat to our democracy than extreme partisan gerrymandering. You cannot run fair elections with unfair districts, and so it's incumbent upon the Secretary of State to take leadership on that issue.
As a Democrat facing what would almost certainly be a Republican-controlled legislature, perhaps not by the margins now, but how do you can call for it. Theoretically, she could call for it right now, as some Republicans in the legislature have been doing for years. Beyond just calling for it, how do you make it happen?
Well, there are Republicans in the General Assembly and around the state who want to have fair districts and who want to reform the political process that we have in place right now. I'd like to work with them. I'd like to work with them and work with Democrats and independents who know that we need to change our districting process in this state. I think that having some leadership from the Chief Elections Officer would help to get that done. Unfortunately, we don't have that leadership right now.
Beyond redistricting, which seems like the headline grabber when we talk about election reform, are there other reforms that you think Indiana needs?
Absolutely. We need to work to improve Indiana's voter turnout. Voter turnout has been historically very low in the state over the last several cycles. In 2014, we had the lowest voter turnout in the country. We were 51 out of 51. In 2016, we were a little bit better, but not much better. We were still below most states. So I think that we need, in the Secretary of State's office, working with the General Assembly, to focus on improving voter turnout. I'm a strong supporter of longer voting hours. Indiana has some of the shortest voting hours in the country. I also think that we need to expand voting by mail. Voting by mail is secure. It's also something that we know improves turnout.
You talk about voting by mail and being secure, but that's from at least those at the State House, that's the concern you hear is, and it logically seems to make sense. When you go in person, you're there with the ballot and nobody else is around you telling you what to do. When you're at home getting it by mail, who knows who's talking to you, who knows who's sending it in? Why are those more secure? Why should people not listen to those who say vote by mail is not a secure system?
Well, if we look at what we've seen in the states that do have a robust vote-by-mail system, there haven't been any widespread issues of lack of security or voter fraud or anything along those lines. Those states have developed systems to make sure that the voting-by-mail process is secure. We have a procedure here in Indiana, too, that over the last several years has worked pretty well. I think that we need to build upon that, and there are a lot of benefits to voting by mail too. If you receive a ballot in the comfort of your own home, you have plenty of time to do research on candidates or dig a little bit deeper and make a more informed decision.
There was a recent report that came out of a study done by MIT that suggested Indiana has the second worst wait times at the polls in the country. And I think that took a lot of people here by surprise because it's not actually something I think a lot of people often hear when we're talking about those election reforms that may or may not be needed. So were you surprised by that report, and what, if anything, should we do about it?
Yeah, I was not surprised by that report. You know, I think that's consistent with us having one of the lowest voter turnouts in the country. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that state government has done to make it harder for people to vote, and then there are some things that we could do to ease some of that pressure and make it easier steps that we have just failed to take. So I'm not surprised that our wait times are long. I think that things like longer polling hours, giving people options like voting by mail will work to take some of the pressure off wait times at the polling places.
Some believe voting by mail would actually be a cheaper system, but certainly longer polling hours is not. To keep them open longer, you have to have those poll workers longer, and everything costs more money.
Yeah.
How do you get around that?
I mean, if we should have extended polling hours, and obviously we'd have to invest in that. I think that that's to be expected. We'd have to work with the General Assembly to make sure that the funding is available. But when we're talking about something as fundamental as the ability to exercise your right to vote, we need to make some basic investments in doing that.
There hasn't been a Democrat who's won a Secretary of State's race since 1990. That guy's now the mayor of Indianapolis. How do you face that sort of uphill battle?
I'm excited, right? You know, I think that there are some real opportunities. I think that Indiana is going to be very competitive this year. You know, people around the state that I've talked to are ready for a change. They're ready for some balance in state government, and I think that we're going to see a pretty high voter turnout too. That gives us, I know, the opportunity to win, and we're just going to do everything we can the last several weeks of this campaign to get around the state, to share our vision with people so that people know that there's a clear choice in the Secretary of State's race.
On that issue of balance, that's something we often hear from Democrats, with Republicans controlling every office at the State House as well as both houses of the legislature. Is that a good enough? I mean, people have voted for Republicans for a long time in a lot of these offices. Is the balance argument really landing with Hoosiers?
Most people I talk to do think that both parties should be working together and that we should be governing from somewhere in the middle. So that's an important part of why I think we need some change in state government. Over the last several years, we've seen some policies out of state government that have been, I think, much more ideologically driven, as opposed to focusing on things that are going to move our state forward, grow our economy. If we have both parties at the table, we're more likely to get results like that.
On the issue of balance, Connie Lawson, when I posed that question, talked about a very recent example of this Democratic Party accidentally sent out faulty absentee ballot applications to a lot of voters. And Connie Lawson was alerted to the problem, stepped up and said, I want clerks to accept these. Yes, they don't have something that technically state law says they should, but we don't want to deny people their votes. Isn't that a good case for the balance is already there because she's acting in a nonpartisan way?
So I think it's pretty clear that Secretary Lawson has done a lot of things that have made it harder for people to vote in this state and that have reduced our voter turnout. And initially, Secretary Lawson was not saying that those forms should be accepted. It's pretty clear that the absentee ballot forms complied with the spirit of state law. You know, obviously there were some issues with them, and I'm glad that everything got resolved. But initially, Secretary Lawson wasn't pushing for those to be accepted. And there are other examples, like the voter purge last year. Secretary Lawson eliminated about 500,000 Hoosier voters from the voter rolls. A federal judge later came in and said that that was illegal, that violated federal law. I don't think that that was an area of bipartisan compromise or consensus.
Is there an issue that's not being talked about in this race that you think should be?
Well, one of the issues, Brandon, that you and I talked about recently was the issue of campaign finance reform. You know, Secretary Lawson, the Secretary of State is responsible for several different areas. One of them is to regulate auto dealerships. Secretary Lawson has taken about 20% of her total campaign contributions from auto dealers, just shy of 20%. And she has taken over $100,000 from one individual auto dealer. I think that it's very hard to impartially regulate an industry if such a substantial chunk of your campaign contributions are coming from that industry. I've said that I will not take donations from that industry. More broadly, I think that we need to look at campaign finance reform in this state. There is far too much money in politics, And as you know, in Indiana, there are basically unlimited campaign contributions are permissible. I think we need to change that.
Thanks so much for sitting down with me.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.